Hello, and welcome to Humanities Matter, brought to you by Brill. I am Emily Tamkin, and this week we will be looking at key issues in the field of humanities. I'm speaking today with Teio Meedendorp. He is the senior researcher at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and he, along with Yves Vasseur, who was the General Commissioner at the Mons Cultural Capital of Europe in 2015, wrote the article, A Case of Mistaken Identity, concerning the photographic portrait of Vincent van Gogh, age 13. They wrote it for the journal Oud Holland. Teio, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
So to start off, before we really dig into the meat of the article, very early on in the piece, you called a painted self-portrait a selfie, which I loved.
Yeah.
You then say that, you say that selfies don't always provide a faithful likeness, but I was thinking about it, and even today on Instagram or whatever, artistry does sometimes overtake likeness, right? When you think of like the famous celebrities, influencers, do you think of today's selfies being in the tradition of Vincent van Gogh?
Well, maybe perhaps a little bit. I think perhaps more in a limited way. Always have to ask, of course, with the selfie, what's it made for? What's the purpose? Is it for fun? Is it perhaps showing that you're a creative? Then the selfie people make by the telephone and things. And of course, you can also work on something like you want to purvey some kind of mood or you're in or whatever. In that sense, of course, it comes close to painted self-portraits and how an artist can research himself in the term of portraits and making his own self-portraits, you might say. With Vincent, it's like you can more or less divide his self-portraits into two categories or areas. And the fact it has to do with he didn't make a self-portrait before he went to Paris, for instance. So it's in 85 that he went to Paris. But before that time, from the Dutch period, we do not have a self-portrait or any hinting in this correspondence that he was working on one. So it starts in Paris, and that's the most of them. I mean, there are about almost 35 self-portraits by Vincent, and the larger batch is certainly all from the Paris period. And that's the Paris period is a period of transition with Vincent. It's when he gets out of this darker Dutch period into the brighter, coloristic, later French period, and that's where his whole palette changes. And of course, with that palette change, he has to work on still lifes, landscapes, and books and everything, of course, and also in figure painting and portrait painting. And what people probably not know so much is that in deep down, Vincent wanted to be a portrait painter and a figure painter, but it was always difficult to get models for him. So he was not the easiest man to get along with. But of course, you yourself are your cheapest model. So you buy a mirror and you can make a lot of portraits. And those Paris portraits certainly stand in the tradition of experimenting with color, with brushstroke, but also with aiming at the person looking. Is he angry? Is he more like, we don't have happy portraits by Vincent, perhaps telling. Right. So he tries to capture a kind of mood. It's like Rembrandt did in the 17th century, but you have what they call tronies, so these images of a certain type of looking angry, looking happy, or laughing, and things like that. But later in Paris, and especially his last portrait that he did, the self-portrait behind the easel, that one was, you might say, a more deliberate self-portrait. That was a farewell from Paris self-portrait. He first went afterwards as a self-portrait where he himself looks ill. And he was ill because of the bad food and all the wine, all the drinking in Paris, and he was escaping to the south. And the ones that he did afterwards, so those self-portraits are much more, you might say, focused. So there is one that he made for Gauguin where he portrays himself as a Buddhist. There are the ones, of course, with the bandaged ear, which is to say, hey, I'm still here after he cut off his ear. And then are the ones that he did in Saint-Denis, so to show, again, after a severe crisis, that he was still there. And they portray a certain mood, and they're deliberately aimed at that. So there's a whole range, you might say, to these self-portraits with Vincent, and he was quite aware of that.
Moving into the actual content, the meat of the article, how did you and Yves decide to write about this, to try to determine if this is or isn't Vincent van Gogh?
Well, we came from two different directions. So first we had in 2014, a television program was made in the Netherlands focusing on Vincent van Gogh on a couple of photographs. There was a photograph discovered of a supposedly image of Vincent. And in this TV program, some scientists were asked to make comparisons with these photographs and available photographic images of Vincent. And there were only two. So there was the one where he was 13 years old, and there was the photograph of when he was 19 years old. So we have two photographs. They were compared with scientifically, and the outcome was that the one that was discovered was not Vincent, but the other thing was as well that the other two were also not related. It was probably not the same person, and this came as a big surprise. So this was our angle, you might say, and we dived into it and said, well, how could this be? I mean, this first report, but this is impossible. I mean, these are both Vincents. But then we started to question, well, where does it come from? I mean, who identified these persons as Vincent, the younger one and the older one? And so we started delving into that. And Yves did exactly the same from another angle, because he was based in Brussels. He was working on the exhibition on Van Gogh and the Borinage in 2015 in Mons. And the photographs was used, and he saw a photograph of Vincent with the address of the photographer underneath, and which was a photographer in Brussels. And he wanted to know more about this photographer, and he found out that this photographer was only in Brussels from 1870 onwards. So this was the portrait of the 13-year-old Vincent. And then in 1870, Vincent would have been 17 years old. Right. So, but this was not ahead of a 17. So he started digging from that angle, and then he came to the Van Gogh Museum and asked, "Well, I found this. I mean, I think it's not Vincent. I think it's his brother. And how do you look at that?" So, in fact, and then our old research came back again, and then we decided, well, we should join hands and write this article together.
Right, join forces.
Join forces, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, as a spoiler for listeners, when they joined forces or hands, when you joined forces or hands, what you found was that what was thought to be a photo of young Vincent is actually of his brother Theo. And now you get into this in the paper, but could you give listeners a sense of how this mix-up happened in the first place? And also, since it was first misidentified in 1957 and questions about who was actually in the photo didn't arise until 2014, what took so long?
Yep. When we looked into it, I mean, so when we did from the TV program, for instance, and wanted to know where does the identification come from? That's only when we found out that it was in 1957 that was the first time that this image was published. We thought it was, well, it is within the family, so it comes somewhere from a family album. We didn't know yet which one, so that's what we started researching. In fact, we had two copies of this photograph of the 13-year-old Vincent. And then we thought, is that where exactly, when did they come into our collection? So one appeared to be from a photo album of Theo himself. So he could very well, of course, have an image of his older brother as a child in this album. But the other one, and that was the one that was first published in '57, came from one of the sisters of Vincent and Theo. So from their collection, so also family related, of course. So it could then be either. But the one who did make the identification was someone who organized an exhibition in 1957 on, you might say, and that was one of the first of a very documentary exhibition on all kinds related to the family of Vincent. And then this picture popped up, and the man who made this exhibition, which was called Marc Edo Tralbaut, he was a Belgian Van Gogh researcher. He was in contact with the family of the sister of Vincent, and they gave him all kinds of archivalia, you might say, that they had in their possession, but they themselves did not know what exactly it was. So it was Tralbaut. He was the one who was responsible for publishing this photograph. Until then, so before 1957, there was only one photograph known of Vincent, and that's the other one, but he was 19 years old. And from this one, we were very sure, because this one was used by Theo's widow, Jo, to publish as the only known photograph of Vincent, which he published in 1914 with the letters. So that was, till then, the only known photograph of Vincent. And all of a sudden, of course, in '57, there's a second one. There's a new one discovered, an early one. And everybody thought that Tralbaut was right. And nobody ever questioned it, because there was no need to question. And that has to do with you might say, the images. When you compare the image of the younger 13-year-old one, you might say, with Vincent, the 19-year-old one, you can see that there are similarities. But when you realize that this photograph has to be at least from 1870, when he's 17 years old, it's quite clear that the young boy is not 17. He might be over 13, but he's not 17. And then when we start researching, what do we know about the likeness of what they look like, both boys? And then it's interesting to know that Vincent himself in 1883 in a letter makes a wonderful comparison of them both, as they are so much alike. I mean, as well as in character, as well as to how they look alike. And there's only one thing, is that Theo is slightly, he has slightly finer features. So he has a rather high forehead. It's not as sloping as Vincent's is. Smaller lines, you might say, and what's most important, the eyes are different. So they both have very bluish green eyes, but Theo's are much lighter. Now, when you compare the photographs, especially, we have more photographs of Theo. Luckily, I mean, there's only this one from 19-year-old of Vincent, but we have about 5 photographs of Theo in different ages, when he was 13, 20, 21, 32. And one striking feature is that these very light eyes. This gives a certain impression. And when you compare the photograph of the 13-year-old Vincent, you might say, you quite see that's not Vincent, because he has darker green-blue eyes. And it's very bright eyes, so it can't be Vincent. And it has to be Theo, and that matches together. That's what he found, of course, when he researched the Brussels photographer, who only started in 1870 on the address given on the photograph. And Theo started working in Brussels in 1873, when he was 15 years old, almost 16. And he had this photograph made exactly the same time when Vincent had his 19-year-old photograph made, because it was a present to their father. Whose birthday was in February 88, when he became 51. And that made the circle around, you might say. So it's just, in this case, simply a case of mistaken identity based on somebody in the 1950s who thought it was Vincent, and nobody ever questioned it, because it could very well be possible.
Right, nobody thought to. That is fascinating. And if you want to hear about how the mystery was finally solved, you should read A Case of Mistaken Identity concerning the photographic portrait of Vincent van Gogh, age 13, in the journal Oud Holland. It was written by Teio Meedendorp, a senior researcher at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, with whom I was speaking today, and Yves Vasseur, the General Commissioner of the Mons Cultural Capital of Europe 2015. Teio, thank you once again for being with me today and speaking about your excellent article.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you.